Can you delay menopause? Well, if you're listening to this, then you may be interested in learning if we actually can. And the answer is, well, maybe slightly. Some factors we can't control, like your genes, and some we can. And you can play the game of extending the life of your ovaries. You can just try to make them this transition through menopause a little bit easier by eliminating some of the symptoms. And then you can do things to actually protect your future self. And as a gerontologist, I think all of these things are important, particularly the last one. So let's talk about what the science says about the age of natural menopause, ANM. You're going to see this in a lot of research studies quoted like that. And we're not talking about medical or surgical menopause when you talk about age of natural menopause, but I'm going to give you some 12 factors that affect our menopause age. And that is including, I will include the medical or surgical menopause. Okay. So let's first start about what we mean by menopause, because it can mean so many things. We were just talking about the menopause birth date, when you've had 12 consecutive months without your period. So if you've lost your period for 10 months, then it came back and showed up again, you're still in perimenopause, and you're going to have to rewind that clock again, start counting again from the beginning. So the average age of menopause in the Western world, let's say, is about 51 years old. Some reach it in their early 40s, and others may not reach it until their mid 50s. Okay, so there's a spectrum here, but this matters a lot because early menopause has been linked to higher risks of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and even increased all-cause mortality. And this is why it's the standard of care to give women who get into menopause in their early 30s for whatever reason, or medical menopause, hormone therapy. Okay, it's just what they do. Why? It's to protect them from these diseases. But what I really can't understand is why isn't this important for women who enter natural menopause in their 40s and 50s? That's not the standard of care. But okay, that's a whole other discussion. But what we do know is that delayed menopause is associated with a longer reproductive span and lower risk of diseases of aging. Why? Because estrogen is protective. Our hormones are protective. We need these balances. And when they're out the window, well, that increases our risk. But there's a lot of things we can do. So I'm not saying you have to do hormone therapy. I'm just saying that plays a role. And that's why if we can delay menopause, it may be actually a good thing. So what is the things that determine when you will hit menopause? I'm going to unpack 12 factors. The first one are things that we can't modify. And that's sort of the foundation. And that's our genes. Okay. It's the strongest predictor of when you'll go through menopause, when you'll have your menopause birth date. So if your mother hit it when she was 50, chances are you'll probably hit it when you're 52. And there's interesting research in 2021 by Nature. And it was over 200,000 women, and they found 290 genetic variants that are tied to ovarian reserve and reproductive aging. And most of the time it's linked to DNA repair. And there's other studies that have zeroed in on a few key genes. I've had somebody on Instagram ask me, like, which genes? Well, there's so many, but if there were 4 or 5 that I had to choose, then it's the ZNF 518A. Get your pen and paper out here if you really want to have this, or pause it. The ETAA1, PNPLA8, and the PALB2 are the most powerful influencers of menopause timing. Okay, so these genes are all part of the body's mechanisms for DNA repair and energy metabolism, but especially inside the ovaries. Okay, the second factor is your race and ethnicity. Can't control that. Black women in the US go through menopause about 1 to 2 years earlier than white women, so around 49 or 50. But in Africa, she goes through menopause somewhere between 47 and 50. And then if you want to get real granular, North Africa versus South Africa. North Africa is about 49, Sub-Saharan Africa 48. And some of this has to do with their education, nutritional status, reproductive history. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And then Chinese women get it around 49, 50, a little bit earlier than white women, and Japanese women a little bit later, somewhere around 50, 52. But what's interesting that there's some studies that show Japanese women who are living in the US, they tend to go to menopause a little earlier than those in Japan. Still later than the US women, but it seems that though the genetics play a role, but the lifestyle and environment also, like her diet, her stress, her US way of living. So she maybe be adopting an American diet, and maybe that influences it. And then if you're talking about India, the women in India, they tend to get, so the youngest women who go through menopause that I've found so far, and it's 46. And again, this could be genetic, could be socioeconomic factors. And we'll go into those little factors as well. If you want to hear about nutrition, yeah, if you're talking about nutrition, so why women in some of these other countries, underdeveloped, let's say, I don't know if that's like the PC word to say it, but underdeveloped, lower socioeconomic countries, they may have nutrition deficiencies. Okay, maybe they're not getting enough protein, maybe they're not getting enough iron, maybe not getting enough vitamins, and this can impair their ovarian function. And over time, because this is chronic, it's not like one day. Maybe they don't have the same healthcare access that we do. Maybe they are they're into forced labor, and this is chronic stress, and this can suppress some of the reproductive function as well. Maybe there's some infections, environmental toxins, and that can also affect your menopause age. A lot of people like to dig into the age of menopause in other countries, but it's interesting because what we're seeing as the life expectancy globally increases, so does the number of years that women are spending in menopause. And that's why the age at which menopause begins really matters. In the early 1900s, so early 1900s, the average life expectancy for women in the US was 48 to 51. That sounds crazy. It doesn't mean that women weren't. You're going to be like, my grandma lived until she was 70 or 80 or whatever. We're just talking about the average. Okay. This is early 1900s. And if you think about it, that's the same age as menopause. So menopause was kind of the end of life. Like you didn't really get a chance to experience post-menopause. So by 1920, the average life expectancy increased to 54. So you can see every decade, people were living longer and longer. So yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of research done on menopause because we didn't live that long, right? And again, those who did, well, I guess maybe they weren't a big enough cohort, although I could still argue this. But anyways, I found it really, really interesting. So the next factor that affects our menopause age that we just can't do anything about is birth weight. How much did you weigh when you were born? If you were under 2.5 kilos, and that's about 5 pounds, or if you were over 4 kilos, which is 8 point something, okay, maybe closer to 9 pounds, then you're at increased risk of earlier menopause. If you were born with a low birth weight, could be because you didn't get enough nutrients when your mother was pregnant. Maybe she was stressed out, and that influences how your own reproductive system develops. And that includes the number and the quality of eggs that you're born with. And then if you have a too high birth weight, oftentimes it's associated with your mother's having diabetes or metabolic issues during pregnancy. And then that can affect your own hormone production. And these early developmental shifts really fall under this thing called this theory called the developmental origins of health and disease theory. And this just says that the conditions in utero, in the body, and early infancy can sort of program the risk of diseases and age-related changes later on in life. So yes, even your birth weight might give you a hint about your menopause timing. Okay. It's not just what happens in your 40s or 50s, but it's what happens in the womb. That's why we always say longevity starts in childhood, right? Now, that's why I also say menopause starts in childhood. And then the next factor of when you will hit menopause is the age of when you had your first period. So if you had early menarche, okay, your period came before you were 12 years old, then you're at 31% higher risk of early menopause. And if you had later menarche, that means after the age of 16, then you'll have a 1-year delay okay? And that's because your reproductive years are marked by a cyclical estrogen exposure. So the earlier you start menstruating, the longer your hormonal system is being active, and then the more cycles, ovulatory cycles that you're going to go through. And that just means more wear and tear on your ovaries. And so the more cycles you have, the faster you're going to deplete your eggs, and then potentially an earlier menopause. And then the later you start your period, you have fewer total cycles, and then slower depletion, and then later menopause. And there's a 2017 analysis from the Nurses' Health Study that included hundreds of thousands of women, confirmed this link that women who started menstruating before 12 had significantly higher odds of early menopause. And it's not only the number of cycles that you have, but it's that lifetime exposure of estrogen that can influence how resilient our ovaries are going to be, and eventually those diseases of aging. The next section we're going to talk about is about reproductive history and then some medical events. So we're going to kind of bypass that, the age of natural menopause. Okay, when you have a medical induced menopause, it's a little bit different. So number 5 factor that influences menopause age is how many pregnancies did you have? Okay, the more pregnancies you had, then the later the menopause, up to 3 births. And that's because each menstrual cycle has ovulation. It releases an egg. And then again, there's wear and tear on the ovaries. So pregnancy just kind of puts a pause button on this whole process. So you're not ovulating during pregnancy. And when you're breastfeeding, you're probably having some reduced hormonal cycles. And then over the lifetime, you're having less exposure to the stress on your ovaries. So it just gives your ovaries a little break. And there's an interesting study that shows that women with 2 to 3 full-term pregnancies tend to reach menopause later than those with 0 or only 1 pregnancy. And then there was another study that showed in Europe that showed that 3 pregnancies was a sweet spot for the delayed menopause, because beyond that, there was just no additional delay in menopause. And what about if you didn't have any pregnancies at all in your life? So women with no pregnancies have a higher risk of entering menopause early. That means under 45, or prematurely, which is before the age of 40. And that because sometimes these women have some fertility issues. Maybe there's PCOS. It's already some issues with their ovaries. They don't have any breaks, those breaks and what pregnancy gives you. And then maybe they have some other issues like autoimmune disease or thyroid issues, metabolic things going on. And then there's the next factor is the medical interventions. Okay, some women don't get to experience natural menopause at all. Is that good, bad? It's debatable. They're just thrown into menopause really suddenly because of some kind of medical treatment and surgery. And that's called surgical or medical induced menopause. And so when you have a surgical menopause, let's say your ovaries are removed, that's an oophorectomy, a bilateral oophorectomy. Okay, that puts you immediately into menopause because you have a huge drop in estrogen and progesterone. And then there's no gradual transition, right? And then that could be maybe because a woman has had ovarian cancer, or maybe she's got endometriosis and other pelvic issues. And the problem with that, very often I meet so many women who tell me that they've had that and they were not given any warning whatsoever that they were going to go straight into menopause, no hormone therapy, nothing. They just didn't know what was going on, because it's literally they wake up from the surgery in a hot flash or with all the menopause symptoms, and they tend to be a bit more intense than those who go through natural menopause. The other reasons why we can get into medical menopause is a hysterectomy. That's when they remove your uterus. And if the uterus is removed, but the ovaries are left intact, your cycles are still continuing. So menopause technically hasn't happened yet, but there are studies that show that women who do have this type of hysterectomy can go into menopause 1 to 2 years earlier. And that's because there's just less blood flow to the ovaries, and their ovaries have been affected, their function's been affected over time. So the next thing that can be influencing is maybe chemotherapy, radiation. This damages those ovarian follicles. And then if they have to keep doing treatments over and over again, this is just like repeated stress on the ovaries, and that could lead to permanent or more temporary damage to the ovaries. And it all depends on maybe the drugs that they're taking, the dosage they have, and the age that they're getting this treatment. So yeah, it can really have an impact. And why does this matter? And that's because women who go through menopause earlier than expected, they're at a higher risk for osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, mood changes, dementia, all of these issues. We really need to take care of women who are doing this, getting through much earlier, and any woman at any time. This is why it's so important to have this discussion about hormone therapy with your doctor, but particularly if this happens to you before the age of 40. Yeah. So anyways, you're not getting any kind of smooth transition into menopause with a medical menopause. It's like slamming the brakes on the estrogen, and overnight impact is super intense. Now, the next factor that determines when you'll hit menopause are some health conditions, usually the ones we can't control. They just kind of happen. Sometimes we can, but you might have had started really, really, really early. But if this is you, you may be going into menopause a little bit earlier. And that is if you've had autoimmune disease, things like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's, Addison's. These can trigger the immune system to attack the ovarian tissue, and that's not good. So that can lead to POI, which is premature ovarian insufficiency. And this is where the ovaries just lose their function before the age of 40. And that affects about 1% of the women. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can set you into an earlier menopause. If you have early onset stroke, or any vascular issues, this again stops the blood flow going to the ovaries, and then just play around with those hormonal signals in the brain. And then they can just immediately throw you into menopause. And then, actually it's worse if you are in this camp and then you have other risk factors like smoking or autoimmune disease. So the next section that we're going to talk about are things that we can modify, their lifestyle, environmental factors that impact when we will go into menopause. So number 8 is smoking. So if you're a smoker, you may be signing off your reproductive years a few years early. So there are studies that show that smoking can lead to early menopause, often by 2 to 3 years. And that's because cigarette smoke has toxic compounds, and those toxins accelerate the loss of those ovarian follicles. The follicles are the little sacs that hold your eggs and lead to faster ovarian aging. And it also, smoking disrupts your ability to produce and even respond to estrogen again. So if you're a heavy smoker, you're smoking 1 pack or more per day, you can enter menopause up to 3 years earlier than non-smokers. And if you're a light or a moderate smoker, then that's also been linked to earlier menopause, but I don't have a timeline for that. But also secondhand smoke exposure during your developmental years can also play a role. So if your parents smoked around you or you were around a lot of smokers, that may impact you going into an earlier menopause. The next modifiable factor of menopause age is alcohol, right? Studies show, and you're going to be a little surprised with this one, that women who drink alcohol moderately may experience menopause a little later than those who don't drink at all. Okay. It's not a green light to go start pouring wine over your ovaries or drinking a little bit more. But what is the research showing? It's showing that if you're drinking about 1 drink per day, to me, that's a lot. Because I don't drink. I have had some drinks in my life and I will have some sometimes, but wow, it's a rare event. But if you have about 1 drink a day, you may have a slightly delayed menopause. And that's about 6 months to 1 year earlier. I'm sorry, later. So is it worth it? I don't think so. And if you're a heavy drinker, then you don't get any of these benefits at all. And in fact, you're going to have the opposite effect. And if you're a non-drinker, and we're talking about lifelong abstainers, they've found in some studies to reach menopause earlier than light to moderate drinkers. Jeez, but that's not me. Okay. I'm 54 and I just got my period 2 days ago. What's going on? Alcohol, it's slowing down the breakdown of estrogen. Okay. In the liver. Liver needs to detox this stuff, and it's got to detox the alcohol first. So estrogen's got to take a back seat and sit around in circulation, in a toxic state, which I don't like. So there's consequences for that. But even if it's toxic, evidently that estrogen is still extending the life of your ovaries. Okay. I guess it's better toxic than none at all. Honestly, that's kind of crazy. And alcohol may also stimulate the ovaries and adrenal glands to produce more estrogen. And I don't know why. The only thing I can understand that estrogen can take a back seat, but making more estrogen, that's kind of new to me. Anyways, there is a catch to all of this because alcohol is a risk factor for breast cancer, liver disease, cardiovascular disease. Is it really worth it? In my opinion, no. So, yeah, you got to weigh the risks versus benefits if you're talking about alcohol. The next factor of menopause age is exercise or physical activity, let's say. It's a powerful tool in healthy aging, in longevity. Moderate physical activity can even help delay menopause. But like anything in the body, it's all about balance. So, moderate, we're talking about brisk walking, yoga, light strength training, swimming. These women tend to have later onset of menopause. Okay, it's delayed menopause because exercise is good for you, right? That balances your hormones, it improves insulin sensitivity, it reduces that inflammation or that chronic inflammation. It helps maintain healthy body composition. All of this stuff is really good for your ovaries. And then the bonus is that all this activity is going to help us through our menopause symptoms. Not all the time, every time, but it certainly has shown to improve that menopause transition. However, it's not the more the better, right? Extreme training, and we're talking about marathon runners, elite athletes, women who overtrain, who do not allow themselves to recover, they're more likely to go through menopause earlier. Okay. And that's because when you have lower body fat, and that reduces your estrogen storage. Okay, you have the HPO axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. And this is that hormonal feedback loop that regulates the menstrual cycle. That gets damaged or suppressed. And then, yeah, so you have a lot of negative things, right? Just like anything, it's balanced. So some of the research shows that women with high intensity exercise routines or very low BMIs have a higher likelihood of premature ovarian insufficiency. When you kind of think about it, those overtrainers and undereaters and all that stress on the body can stop your period, right? That's not a healthy thing to do. That's not supporting your reproductive function. So yeah, exercise is amazing, but it's like a Goldilocks, not too much, not too little. We just want it to get enough to keep our ovaries happy. Now, the next modifiable factor that we can try to play around with is diet and weight. Okay, our body composition and what you eat is not just about how we look. It can really influence our hormones and our ovarian health, and even when menopause age starts. So underweight women, that's women who have a BMI of less than 18.5, have go through menopause earlier. Okay, that's, again, we mentioned that earlier, lower body fat, less estrogen. There's just no fat stores to help that with the estrogen. And then there's just more stress on that HPO axis. Maybe they've got some nutritional deficiencies. And we mentioned that earlier. Remember, in these underdeveloped countries, if you're not getting enough nutrition, not enough protein, that can affect your egg quality and just how the ovaries are functioning, right? However, if you're obese, you're gonna like this one. If you're obese, if you have a BMI over 30, you're more likely to go through later menopause. There's a study that showed you even have 50% higher odds of going through menopause after age 52 to 53. And that's because those fat tissue, right? The fat cells like to hold on to that estrogen. That's why if you have estrogen dominance, and again, it's estrogen is great, we love it, but it's got to be in balance with progesterone. That fat tissue promotes estrone. It's a weak form of estrogen, but it still may help prolong that ovarian function. However, it's not protective, and there's some major risks that happen when we are obese, and that's, if you're talking about menopause, you may have more vasomotor symptoms, meaning more hot flashes, more night sweats. You're higher risk of endometrial and breast cancer, more risk of cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, joint issues, like everything. Okay. Obesity is the number one modifiable risk factor for all diseases of aging, right? Age is the number one. We can't modify that, but obesity, we can. So let's get into a healthy body weight, not too underweight, not too overweight. If you want to get into the nitty gritty of what the studies show about diet and dietary patterns, they show that diets that are high in polyunsaturated fats, those are things that are in seed oils and processed foods, they're linked to an earlier menopause. So it's because they're causing oxidative stress and inflammation when they're eaten in excess. It's not to say, oh, you can't have tahini anymore in your salad dressing. No. Your sesame seeds sprinkled on your, no. It means if you're eating these in excess, and especially if it's the processed foods, then you have an increased risk of putting yourself in earlier menopause and probably more disruptive menopausal symptoms. However, if you're eating a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables and good proteins, whole foods, that's associated with delayed menopause. Well, hello. And a lot of other things. That's probably because there's just more antioxidants that's protecting the ovaries. There's enough proteins and healthy fats, and that's helping with our hormones. And then you're getting enough calories, and you're not going through these extremes of highs and lows of weight loss and weight gain. And there's a study from the UK women's cohort that found that women with higher intakes of oily fish and fresh legumes had significantly delayed menopause. So break out that salmon and some lentils. And then we have refined carbohydrates like white pasta and rice that's showing have earlier menopause. So try to reduce those. Super interesting, huh? That ovaries are really paying attention to what you eat. And it's not about looking great. It's really about your nourishing your body. Delaying menopause is a nice bonus, but I think the biggest bonus is you're protecting your future self. Now, the last factor that can be related to when you will hit menopause are toxins and environmental exposures. So what you breathe, what you drink, what you absorb from the environment around you can really influence when you're going to hit menopause, and you're probably not even realizing it. So we'll only talk about a couple of them here, like heavy metals. And what comes up in the research most are lead and arsenic. When you have high levels of lead, there's a strong link to earlier menopause. I don't have by how many years, it doesn't say, but it's especially happens to women who are exposed through contaminated water, industrial environments, things like that. And then lead, it just accumulates in the bones, and then it's released during the periods that you're having high bone turnover, like in perimenopause. And that can have a compounding effect on our hormones and our ovarian function. Arsenic is found in contaminated groundwater. And this is particularly, these were studies I think that were done in South Asia and Latin America, and they've been associated with ovarian dysfunction and accelerated menopause. Then there's those things that we all know about that we should probably be avoiding as much as we possibly can, because we're never perfect, is our BPAs, phthalates, and other things. So BPA is that bisphenol A that's found in those plastic water bottles or your plastic storage things, the canned food linings, receipts. Try not to, when somebody offers you a receipt at the supermarket, just say no thanks. I can do digital now. These things, they mimic estrogen and they interfere with our hormone balance. And then there's the phthalates that are used in fragrances and cosmetics and skincare and all this stuff that can also affect our hormone levels and our ovarian reserve. There's certain studies that show that it impairs the follicular development, and as well as that HPO signaling, and then again, your menopause age. So what can we do? This is so simple. Just switch to glass, right? Glass bottles or glass Tupperware instead of those plastic things, right? And then you can choose fragrance-free perfumes or anything you buy in terms of that you're putting on your body, lotions and potions and creams, get it fragrance-free. And if there's a fragrance, then it better be like essential oil or something like that. And you can check through these apps. There's plenty of apps. There's a Skin Deep one by the Environmental Working Group. There's another app that I use a lot called Yuka. And it's just literally, you scan the barcode and it gives you the level of toxicity and green light, red light, super simple. And that's it. So your environment really is talking to your hormones. And sometimes it's shouting. So try to lower those toxins in your life. And yeah, let's just kind of wrap it up. This is your menopause timeline. Let's take a breath and let's look at things again. You've just learned the age at which you're going to hit menopause. And we know it's kind of random, but it's also a result of those complex interplays between your genetics, lifestyle, your environment, and your birth story, right? You can't do anything about some of the genetics, but you can do things about your lifestyle and environment. You can shape your menopause timing. So your genes, they set the stage, but the habits and environment write a pretty good chunk of the script. What can we do? Again, quit or avoid smoking, balance that alcohol take, prioritize your nutrition and maintain healthy weight, healthy body weight, manage your stress. These are not only great menopause tools, but they're longevity tools and are part of your biohacking menopause toolbox. So remember, longer reproductive span means more years of natural estrogen, which has been associated with, again, with the lower risk of osteoporosis and bone fractures, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, and possibly reducing all-cause mortality. We're going to die something someday, right? We can't reduce everything, but we try to do our best. Delay, delay, delay. I hope these tips have been useful to you. And if you have any questions, let me know. And if you want to dive deeper into these conversations, I'd love to invite you to join our private biohacking menopause membership group. We have two groups. We have a free group and we have a paid group. And the paid group, of course, I'm there all the time. And we have weekly meetings, bi-weekly meetings. We're meeting not only with me for live Q&As and breathwork classes, but we have a great lineup of guests, which include mostly my guests on the podcast, which if you've listened to them and you love these guests, you're going to love having very intimate one-on-one time with them because they charge hundreds of dollars for their time, or they're not accessible at all. And we get to have them in our private group. And the women who are in our group are so amazing. We're very like-minded and we learn so much from each other. Very supportive. We have challenges as well to get you onto good, healthy habits and make menopause the best years of your life. And if you want to dip your toes into the free menopause group, it's also called Biohacking Menopause Support Group. You can find that in the show notes. So thank you for hanging out with me this far. You made it to the end, and really let's make menopause this most informed, supported, and powerful chapter of our lives. So have a wonderful day or good night, good morning, wherever you're at.